The theater lights fade. The applause that once thundered like a storm now recedes into memory. At the far edge of fame, a man sits in the silence of his own making, counting heartbeats that used to race with the rhythm of crowds. He was once Iceman, his gaze as sharp as a blade. He was once Jim Morrison, a fire burning against the darkness. He once wore the cape and mask of Batman, striding beneath Gotham's neon skies. But behind every once was, there remained another figure. No costume, no soundtrack, only a thinning breath and thickening memories. Beneath the armor of every legend lies a private story, at times dazzling, more often jagged, that we rarely get to see. This journey begins with a simple promise. If you ever admired him on screen, you deserve to know what lived behind the screen. The hairline fractures of a childhood that looked ordinary but wasn't, the sudden blow of devastating loss, the merciless discipline of a performer obsessed with truth, the hands he couldn't hold on to, and the betrayal of a body that silenced the very voice that built his career. One by one, the masks will come off, not to expose wreckage, but to reveal the inner framework of a life, the way grief, love, and faith propped up and sometimes broke down, an uncompromising talent. Before the final spotlight dimmed, there were blinding highs, sold-out premieres, glowing reviews, frantic phone calls that said, "We need you, at any cost." But the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. And the place where shadows gathered wasn't backstage, but in the quiet room after the performance, when the makeup was wiped away and the noise of the world seemed unplugged. That's where the questions surfaced. Who am I once the role is gone? What have I lost along the way? Why does victory feel so cold at the end of the day? To understand a legend, you can't begin at the mountaintop. You have to start at the base, where sweat and dust cling to the rocks. A family of 3 boys. Dinners that sometimes echoed with laughter, sometimes with silence that stretched too long between parents already worn thin. A child who learned to read adult expressions before he could memorize multiplication tables. Who learned to hide tears by biting his lip. Who learned to stand tall when the wind rattled the walls of home. Those early defenses, silencing emotion, holding it deep, accidentally became the foundation of his acting. Audiences saw the steel in his eyes, but they couldn't see the storm raging behind them. Then came the first shattering. A marriage broken apart, leaving 3 sons with a father who offered more business deals than affection. The house was still standing, but the roof of safety had caved in. And when home no longer shelters you, where does a child escape? He found it on stage. A small patch of floor, but one lit with lamps, with words scripted, with order restored. A place where pain could be spoken aloud without being scolded as weakness. Standing there under those lights, the boy learned for the first time, if I can name the unspeakable, maybe I won't feel so alone. But life rarely stops at a single crack. The second strike came on the very edge of his dream in New York. His brother, co-conspirator of boyhood, partner in mischief, suddenly gone, like a candle snuffed by the wind. That kind of loss redraws the entire map of the heart. The roads that used to lead home now ended in emptiness. From then on, time was not measured in calendars, but in 2 eras, before the tragedy and after. Why did audiences always feel he was so real on screen? Because he didn't borrow feelings. He bled his own. The same tendons stretched by grief, the same nerves wired by loss, were what he summoned for every scene. Not everyone agreed with this method. It demanded a rawness that exhausted co-workers, fractured family bonds, and left the artist himself drained. But if you asked him whether the art was worth the cost, he answered with actions, not words. As we step deeper into this story, it will feel like walking through a gallery of rooms. One filled with posters and awards, another stacked with dusty home videos, another hung with unsent letters, another showing a photo with his father on a vast New Mexico ranch, later carved apart by taxes. Then the clinical room, bright lights, plastic tubes, the smell of antiseptic. And finally the dark room, where a man learned to speak without sound, letting cameras, masks, and his eyes do the talking. If you thought this was simply a tale of fame, fall, and tragedy, you may discover something different. Sometimes the most radiant moments are not when we stand before the world, but when we face ourselves and don't run away. A role ends with applause. A life ends in silence. But between those 2 points lie countless unanswered questions, and it's the questions that keep us leaning in. So here is the invitation. Don't just revisit the movie scenes you loved. Step quietly into the backstage of a soul, where every choice has a price, every victory leaves a scar, and every silence holds meaning. When the curtain rises again, you may see why the boy who learned to endure silence became the man who could hold an audience breathless. And maybe, inside his story, you'll find a fragment of your own, a sorrow you've never named, a dream you've never spoken, a courage waiting to be called forth. That's the promise of this journey. Not just the life of a star, but the map of a soul, with peaks, valleys, winding paths, and unmarked turns. Take a breath. In the next chapter, we'll return to the beginning, his childhood, to see how the first bricks were laid that built the towering figure known as Val Kilmer. Every towering story begins in the soil of childhood, and for Val Kilmer, that soil was cracked early. He was born in 1959, the middle of 3 sons in Los Angeles. At first glance, his childhood looked ordinary, even comforting. His father, Eugene, dealt in real estate, carrying the steady hum of ambition. His mother, Gladys, stitched love into every corner of their modest home, her gentleness wrapping the boys in small, everyday acts of care. There were backyard games, laughter between brothers, the warm noise of a family that seemed whole. But beneath that surface, fractures spread quietly. The first major rupture arrived when Val was only 9. His parents' marriage collapsed, and the household that had once held familiar rhythms suddenly broke apart. Val and his brothers stayed with their father, yet the boy quickly felt the weight of distance. Eugene was not the kind of parent who offered easy affection. For Val, every conversation felt like crossing a cold and invisible canyon. Later in life, he would admit, "I became quiet, thoughtful, withdrawn." These were not just words. They were the survival strategy of a child learning to carry adult sorrow before he even understood what it meant. He spent hours in silence, sketching thoughts inward, wrapping himself in imagination. The void left by his parents' separation never really closed. It reshaped him. Some children find rebellion in loss, but Val found retreat, a turning inward that sharpened his observation of people and deepened the well of emotions he would later draw upon. Even then, the seed of the artist had been planted. He was beginning to understand that every gesture, every silence, every shadow could tell a story. But the divorce was only the prelude. The second blow came less than a decade later, and it was catastrophic. Wesley, his younger brother, the one who dreamed of filmmaking, the boy who shared secrets and plans with Val, was stolen away by fate. A seizure, a fall into the family pool, and just like that, his closest companion was gone. Val was 17, standing at the edge of adulthood, about to leave for Juilliard in New York. Instead of stepping into the future with excitement, he found himself swallowed by grief so heavy it nearly drowned him. He later confessed it took him 2, maybe 3 years just to feel steady again. Imagine being 17, your dreams stretching out before you, only to have them strangled by the cruel reminder of mortality. It carved emptiness into his chest, a hollow that no success, no applause could ever truly fill. Behind every role, every ovation lived the echo of Wesley's absence, the laughter that would never return, the projects that would never be made, the brotherly bond broken too soon. What kind of resilience does it take to survive such losses? Perhaps this is why his performances carried such piercing intensity. He wasn't just playing a character. He was channeling an ache that was already branded into his soul. To audiences, his eyes seemed to carry more than the lines of a script. They carried decades of solitude, the tremor of someone who had learned far too young how fragile life can be. The twin agonies of a fractured home and a brother's untimely death became the bedrock of his inner world. They created in him a kind of gnawing solitude, a loneliness so intimate it was almost another organ. And yet, out of that emptiness came an unexpected gift. Art became a sanctuary. On stage, he could pour grief into roles, turning suffering into presence, pain into something that audiences could recognize, admire, even love. His craft was not an escape, but a transformation. Alchemy that took heartbreak and made it luminous. Even in his earliest roles, you could sense it. The steel in his Iceman, the fire in his Morrison, the haunting fragility in his Doc Holliday. These were not simply learned techniques. They were echoes of childhood wounds still vibrating beneath the surface. Every gesture, every pause, carried the memory of Wesley's smile, the silence with his father, the ache of watching family dissolve. And perhaps that is what defined Val Kilmer more than fame ever could. He learned early that silence could be louder than words, that loss could be as instructive as triumph, and that the human heart, when broken, could become a vessel wide enough to hold both unbearable sorrow and unforgettable brilliance. As adolescence gave way to adulthood, Val did not shed these burdens. He carried them onto the stage, into auditions, into every character he embodied. For a boy who had learned to shoulder solitude so early, performance was no longer just entertainment. It was survival. The stage lights offered something home no longer could: order, control, and a place where his pain could be both hidden and revealed. But the path was only beginning, and soon the world of professional acting would open before him. A boy forged in grief was about to step into the crucible of Juilliard, where talent, discipline, and the brutal demands of truth would shape him into an artist the world could not ignore. By the time Val Kilmer stepped onto the path of acting, he was already carrying more weight than most of his peers. At 12, when other children were still fumbling through carefree games, he was sitting in an acting class, trying to find a language for the silence inside him. That small classroom was more than a hobby. It was sanctuary. Every role he read, every line he repeated, gave him a chance to pour out grief disguised as character. The applause of a handful of classmates couldn't erase the ache of family fractures, but it whispered one crucial truth: your voice matters. By 16, his determination had sharpened. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing truth. He auditioned for Juilliard, the hallowed conservatory that had already sculpted names like Robin Williams and Christopher Reeve. Against the odds, Val became the youngest student ever accepted into the drama division. For him, it was not simply an academic achievement. It was proof that the raw storms he carried inside could be transformed into art strong enough to command the respect of masters. But even as his talent was recognized, his stubborn devotion to authenticity made him stand apart. During an early audition for a hamburger commercial, he was asked to deliver cheerful lines about the product. The boy, barely 12 at the time, refused. "I can't say words I don't believe," he explained. It cost him the role and would cost him many more opportunities later in life. Yet in that refusal lived a declaration: integrity over convenience, truth over applause. This was not the path of the easy star. It was the lonely road of an uncompromising artist. The years at Juilliard were both exhilarating and brutal. Val immersed himself in Shakespeare, Chekhov, and the towering giants of theatre. Nights were spent under dim lights in off-Broadway theatres, rehearsing until dawn, eating little, sleeping less. What might have looked like discipline from the outside was, to Val, devotion. Each line of text was a lifeline. Each role a chance to let the unspoken grief of his brother's absence take shape in a way the world could recognize. He lived frugally, sharing cramped apartments, surviving on little more than the fuel of ambition. Yet he never wavered. If he was to succeed, it would not be by bending to industry cliches, but by insisting that every performance carry the weight of truth. His classmates admired his intensity, even as some whispered that it was too much, that such single-minded focus might one day consume him. And yet, for Val, there was no other way. In his view, acting wasn't about pretending, it was about becoming. When he stepped into a role, he demanded to inhabit it fully, to breathe the air of that life, to think its thoughts, to suffer its pain. Anything less felt like betrayal, not just to the character, but to himself. This uncompromising stance often left him isolated. While others networked and took roles for exposure, Val passed on anything that felt false. His mantra was simple but heavy. Better to lose an opportunity than to betray the soul of the character. Such words carried the echo of his personal losses. He had already seen life strip away what mattered most. How could he cheapen what little he still had by settling for lies on stage? In those long, cold New York nights, when the city hummed with indifferent traffic and his stomach growled from missed meals, Val often whispered to himself, "I must keep going. I must not let Wesley be forgotten." Each performance became a tribute to his brother's memory, each curtain call a promise that grief could be alchemized into brilliance. The off-Broadway stage became a crucible. Small roles, faint applause, scripts that barely drew an audience, all of it stitched together an armor against indifference. Every whispered line was both a defense against loneliness and an offering to the world. Through this relentless pursuit, Val forged a presence that was raw, piercing, and unmistakably his own. Looking back, these years were not glamorous. They were relentless, hungry, fragile. But they revealed the pattern that would define his life. Integrity before convenience, truth before applause, craft before comfort. It was the beginning of a career that would both elevate him to immortal roles and exact unbearable costs. The boy who once trembled with grief was becoming a man who trembled with conviction. And soon the crucible of New York would hand him over to the glare of Hollywood. There, his refusal to compromise would collide with fame's relentless machinery. He would rise quickly, dazzling the world, but he would also begin to sense the cruel irony. The higher he climbed, the more hollow his victories sometimes felt. By the mid-1980s, Val Kilmer's determination and devotion to craft began to bear fruit. After years of grinding on stage and turning down roles that felt hollow, Hollywood came calling with opportunities that would catapult him from theater obscurity to the heart of popular culture. His first real taste of cinematic attention came with Top Secret. in 1984, a parody spy film that showcased his comedic timing and natural charisma. Though campy and often ridiculous, the film revealed a side of Val many hadn't seen before, a willingness to throw himself completely into a role, no matter how outlandish. He sang, danced, and delivered slapstick with the same seriousness he once gave to Shakespeare, proving that even comedy deserved his full commitment. But it was Top Gun in 1986 that branded him into the cultural imagination. At just 25, he donned the flight suit of Tom Iceman Kazansky, the unflinching fighter pilot and rival to Tom Cruise's Maverick. Overnight, Val became an icon. The sunglasses, the icy stare, the confident smirk. They weren't just a character. They became a symbol, etched into posters, locker walls, and collective memory. To this day, millions still associate him first with that cool, impenetrable gaze. And yet, the irony was bitter. Val had not wanted the role. He saw the script as shallow, the characters as thin sketches. He accepted it out of contractual obligation, not passion. That reluctance shadowed his entire experience with the film. While the world fell in love with Iceman, Val saw only a compromise, a glittering cage that bound him to fame he neither sought nor trusted. Later, he admitted that Top Gun was both a blessing and a curse. The role gave him recognition, but at the cost of control over his image. This paradox, fame without fulfillment, would haunt him throughout his career. In the public's eyes, he was dazzling, untouchable, immortal. Behind the scenes, he was restless, uneasy, even resentful. The applause felt empty when it came from a performance that didn't align with his values. For a man who had sworn never to betray the soul of a character, it was unsettling to realize the role that made him a star was one he hadn't believed in. Still, Hollywood moved quickly to capitalize on his newfound fame. Offers poured in, scripts stacked high, directors eager to harness the Iceman effect. Val's star rose, but so too did whispers of his intensity, his difficulty, his refusal to play the easy game. He wasn't a studio puppet, and he wasn't afraid to show it. That defiance, admirable to some, marked him as difficult to others. At home, the strain was already showing. Long hours on set and relentless press tours carved deep lines into his personal life. Relationships suffered as his devotion to authenticity pulled him further from those closest to him. Even moments of triumph felt fragile, haunted by the memory of his brother Wesley and the unresolved tension with his father. Fame amplified everything: his brilliance, his conflicts, his isolation. Yet for all the paradox and pain, these were the years when Val Kilmer became more than a promising actor. He became a household name. The boy who once whispered lines in off-Broadway shadows was now plastered across billboards and spoken about in the same breath as Hollywood's elite. It was dazzling, yes, but it was also dangerous, because with every cheer came a question that gnawed at him. If I didn't want this, why does it feel like I can't escape it? In the years that followed, that very question would shape his choices, his clashes, and his descent into both artistic triumph and personal turmoil. The stage had given him sanctuary, but Hollywood had handed him a double-edged sword, one that gleamed beautifully while cutting painfully deep. If Top Gun made Val Kilmer a star, it was the next wave of roles that revealed the depth and danger of his craft. He wasn't interested in being just another leading man smiling from glossy magazine covers. He wanted to disappear inside characters, to live them, breathe them, bleed them. And he was willing to go further than most actors dared. In 1991, he took on the role of Jim Morrison in The Doors, directed by Oliver Stone. For Val, this wasn't just a job, it was possession. He studied Morrison's recordings obsessively, imitated his speech patterns, sang his songs himself rather than lip-syncing. He wore Morrison's clothes, walked like him, even lived like him off-set. For months, friends said it was as if Jim Morrison had stepped back into the world, embodied in Val's tall frame and hypnotic presence. The performance drew critical acclaim, but it came with a price. Castmates and even Stone admitted that working with him was exhausting, his devotion so total it sometimes blurred reality. Val wasn't just acting, he was consuming himself. 2 years later, in Tombstone, he transformed again, this time into Doc Holliday. Gaunt, fevered, equal parts charm and menace, he gave the role a haunting fragility that critics still call one of his finest performances. The gunslinger's wit and sickness mirrored Val's own paradox. Brilliance carried on a body trembling at the edge of collapse. The portrayal was so convincing that it overshadowed nearly every other character in the film. For audiences, it was unforgettable. For Val, it was another reminder that embodying a role with such intensity meant losing pieces of himself in the process. Then came Heat, 1995, alongside Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, two titans of cinema. Here, Val found a kind of fleeting solace. Among equals, he felt seen not as a difficult star, but as a craftsman whose obsession with authenticity was shared. For once, the brilliance did not feel isolating. It felt like communion. Yet even in triumph, the shadow lingered. Because behind the accolades, the reputation of being impossible to work with grew louder. Studio whispers, press articles, and gossip painted him as mercurial, intense, sometimes even hostile. What others saw as devotion, the industry branded as difficulty. He was both admired and feared, a man you wanted on screen but not always on set. At home, his personal life was unraveling. Marriage to Joanne Whalley, once a sanctuary, strained under the weight of his all-consuming method. To play Morrison, he lived as Morrison. To play Holliday, he nearly became a ghost. But while his audience applauded, his family lived with absence. His children saw less of him, his wife carried more of the burden, and intimacy grew thin. Val would later confess, "I give everything to become them, and yet I lose pieces of myself." It was not just an artistic statement, it was a cry of truth. This was the paradox of Val Kilmer's method. The deeper he dug, the more the world admired him, but the less of him remained intact. It was a dangerous alchemy, turning grief into brilliance, heartbreak into art. But like all alchemy, it consumed the alchemist along the way. And so by the mid-1990s, Val had cemented himself as one of Hollywood's most magnetic actors, but also as one of its most enigmatic. His devotion created legends, yet left him isolated. His method birthed masterpieces, yet fractured his personal life. The cost was mounting, and though the world saw only the dazzling surface, inside, Val Kilmer was beginning to understand the cruel truth. Every triumph was a double-edged sword, cutting deeper into the man even as it immortalized the actor. For many actors, wearing the cape and cowl of Batman is the pinnacle of success. It's a role that comes with instant immortality, a place in pop culture so secure that every line, every scene, is replayed for decades. For Val Kilmer, though, stepping into Batman Forever in 1995 was less a dream fulfilled and more a crucible of frustration. Encased in a thick rubber suit that weighed nearly 50 pounds, Val found himself suffocated, literally and figuratively. The mask limited his ability to emote. The costume dictated how he moved, breathed, even stood. What the audience saw on screen was a sleek, mysterious hero. What Val experienced was isolation, exhaustion, and an overwhelming sense that he was no longer acting but merely existing inside a corporate machine. To him, the suit became less a symbol of heroism and more a prison. On paper, the film was a triumph. Batman Forever grossed hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide, introducing Val to an even larger global audience. Children dressed as Batman for Halloween. His image was plastered on toys, posters, and lunchboxes. From the outside, it looked like the ultimate victory. Yet Val himself felt hollow. He would later describe the role as one of the most alienating experiences of his career. "It's hard to act when you can't move your face," he admitted, and though he meant it literally, the words carried a deeper truth. Behind the mask, he felt invisible, disconnected from the art he valued most. The Batman experience revealed an irreconcilable tension within him. Hollywood wanted him as a star, a franchise anchor, a marketable figurehead. Val wanted to be an artist, a craftsman chasing authenticity. The more successful the studio system made him, the more estranged he felt from himself. Every accolade brought applause, but also an ache. Was this the price of being true to one's art? Or was he betraying it by playing along? Even in personal life, the mask seemed to linger. Friends described how fame began to close in around him, how conversations were interrupted by paparazzi, how even ordinary dinners became spectacles. Val, who once sought refuge on stage as a boy to escape loneliness, now found the glare of fame amplifying that loneliness instead. The irony was cruel. The higher his star climbed, the harder it was to be seen as simply Val, the man. What made it more painful was watching the ripple effect on his family. Joanne Whalley, already straining under his all-consuming devotion to roles, now lived with the added pressure of being married to Batman. Their children, still young, felt the absence of a father increasingly consumed not only by work, but also by the obligations of celebrity. What should have been the pinnacle of professional triumph became another fracture line in his private world. Looking back, Val would often describe the Batman role as a turning point. It taught him that fame could be both seductive and suffocating, that success could taste sweet, yet leave a bitter aftertaste. He began to recognize that Hollywood's brightest spotlight could also be its coldest shadow. The mask of Batman gave Val Kilmer global recognition, but it also forced him to confront an uncomfortable reality. Being famous did not mean being fulfilled. The rubber suit restricted more than his movements. It symbolized the invisible constraints of an industry that demanded spectacle over substance. And for a man who lived for truth in performance, that was the most suffocating prison of all. Away from the cameras, Val Kilmer's personal life carried the same intensity as his performances. His relationships were rarely casual. They burned bright, often too bright, and left behind the lingering smoke of heartbreak. For Val, love was not a quiet companionship. It was a storm, a collision of vulnerability and passion, and it often mirrored the turbulence of his own restless soul. One of his earliest high-profile romances was with Cher, 13 years his senior. At the time, she was already a superstar, a woman who had seen the rise and fall of fame and carried both scars and wisdom. For Val, who still bore the hollow echoes of a fractured childhood and his brother's death, Cher's presence was magnetic. She was strong, fearless, and seemed to hold a kind of warmth he craved. Their connection was electric, but fragile. The demands of Val's rising career meant long absences, and the shadows of his past whispered constantly that happiness could never last. He would later say, "Once Cher works her way into your heart, she never leaves." It was both a confession of devotion and an acknowledgement of the inevitable heartbreak that followed. Then came Joanne Whalley, the English actress he met on the set of Willow in 1988. Their chemistry was immediate, a spark that quickly turned into marriage. To the press, it looked like a Hollywood fairy tale. Two actors in love, radiant and enviable. Soon, two children, Mercedes in 1991 and Jack in 1995, seemed to complete the picture. For a while, Val had what looked like both, a flourishing career and a family to ground him. But the same intensity that made him a remarkable actor also made him a difficult partner. To become Jim Morrison in The Doors, Val lived as Morrison, blurring the line between role and reality. Joanne often found herself married to men who weren't Val at all, but the characters he embodied. Hotel suites and sets became her battlegrounds of loneliness, while her husband chased the ghosts of his roles. The children felt his absence too, as film after film pulled him away. What the world saw as brilliance, his family experienced as distance. By the mid-1990s, the marriage had begun to unravel. Whispers of infidelity, rumors of Cindy Crawford, circulated in tabloids, never confirmed but cutting nonetheless. In 1996, the inevitable arrived. Divorce papers, delivered during the filming of The Island of Dr. Moreau. It was a cruel symbol. Art and life colliding violently, leaving fragments of Val's heart scattered between set locations and family memories. The divorce haunted him. He would look back at the first laugh of his daughter, the tiny hand of his son reaching for him, and feel the crushing paradox. He could embody legends on screen, but he struggled to simply be present as a father. "I give everything to become them," he admitted. "And yet, I lose pieces of myself." This was not only true of his artistry, but of his relationships. Later came Daryl Hannah, whose relationship with Val he would describe as the most painful love of my life. They shared quiet evenings on his New Mexico ranch, sunsets bleeding into violet dusk, laughter that felt fragile and precious. Yet the ghosts of his past, the loneliness, the relentless pull of work, the inability to fully hold on to intimacy, haunted the affair. When she eventually married Neil Young in 2018, Val admitted it struck him like a physical blow. Even years later, the wound still ached. Through all of these relationships, a pattern emerged. Val loved with the same uncompromising intensity he brought to his art. But just as roles demanded all of him, so too did his loves. And when he couldn't give everything, the weight of absence grew unbearable. His heart carried scars from both the characters he embodied and the women he loved. By his own confession, he hadn't had a long-term girlfriend in decades. It wasn't for lack of desire. It was the price of a life devoted to authenticity, to a relentless pursuit of truth on screen. Intimacy demanded presence, but his genius often demanded absence. And so his romances, luminous and passionate, left him with memories that flickered like firelight. Beautiful, but impossible to hold. In the end, Val Kilmer's loves were mirrors. They reflected his deepest insecurities, his unspoken longings, his unhealed wounds. They offered sanctuary and torment in equal measure. And like his career, they revealed the paradox of a man whose brilliance illuminated the world while leaving the most intimate corners of his own life in shadow. By the mid-1990s, Val Kilmer's devotion to truth in performance had earned him both admiration and notoriety. To audiences, he was magnetic, unforgettable. To many in Hollywood, he was something else entirely. Difficult. It wasn't a label he chose, but one that grew louder with every set where his uncompromising nature clashed with the machinery of studio filmmaking. The most infamous example came in 1996 during the chaotic production of The Island of Dr. Moreau. The project was troubled from the beginning. Director Richard Stanley was ousted after clashing with the studio, and veteran filmmaker John Frankenheimer was brought in to steady the ship. Into this storm walked Val, already carrying the weight of personal upheaval after the collapse of his marriage. What unfolded became legend. Frankenheimer, exasperated by Val's demands for authenticity, his refusal to bend to shortcuts, and his constant challenges on set, allegedly declared he would never work with the actor again. Crew members whispered stories of shouting matches, delays, and tension thick enough to suffocate the tropical air. Entertainment magazines ran headlines labeling him Hollywood's most impossible actor. For the industry, it was confirmation of a growing suspicion. Val Kilmer was brilliant, yes, but dangerously volatile. What those stories rarely captured was the storm inside him. Val wasn't clashing for ego's sake. He was at war with compromise. He demanded truth in roles that were being shaped by budgets, deadlines, and the whims of executives. To him, cutting corners meant betraying the character, betraying the art. To directors tasked with wrangling dozens of moving pieces, it meant chaos. The very integrity that audiences admired on screen became the fuel for conflict behind it. The press painted him as mercurial, arrogant, even hostile. Articles like the 1996 Entertainment Weekly piece listing stars who make enemies on set sealed the perception. Once such a label sticks, it becomes almost impossible to scrape off. Studios grew wary. Collaborators hesitated. The myth of Kilmer as difficult began to overshadow the reality of his craft. But away from the noise, Val wrestled with guilt. In rare moments of candor, he admitted he had behaved poorly at times, snapping under pressure, letting perfectionism curdle into impatience. Nights alone in apartments or hotel rooms, city lights seeping through blinds. He would sit with the echo of his own heartbeat, replaying arguments in his mind, questioning if the pursuit of authenticity was worth the bridges burned. The truth, of course, was more complicated. Val was not simply a problem actor. He was a man forged in grief, chasing honesty in an industry built on illusion. His intensity unsettled colleagues not because it was meaningless, but because it was uncompromising. He was unwilling to fake, to just get the shot, to paste on a smile for the sake of convenience. That purity, admirable to some, was corrosive to others. And yet, Hollywood thrives on perception as much as performance. Once the word difficult is attached to your name, it sticks like tar. Val's career trajectory, so rapid and dazzling in the 1980s and early 1990s, began to feel less certain. Offers slowed. The spotlight grew harsher. He was still a star, but now one shadowed by suspicion. Looking back, this chapter revealed the paradox at the heart of his life. The very qualities that made him extraordinary: intensity, refusal to compromise, obsession with truth, were the same ones that isolated him. He created art that burned brightly, but the flames sometimes scorched the ground beneath his feet. As the millennium approached, Val Kilmer stood at a crossroads. His artistry was undeniable, his presence magnetic, his performances unforgettable. Yet his reputation as difficult threatened to cage him as surely as the Batman suit once had. And the question grew louder. Could a man so committed to truth survive in an industry built on compromise? When the storms of Hollywood grew too loud, Val Kilmer retreated to the wide open spaces of New Mexico. There, on a sprawling 6,000-acre ranch near Santa Fe, he sought what the industry could never give him: silence, freedom, and a sanctuary where the land itself might absorb the weight of his restless soul. For Val, the ranch was more than property. It was a cathedral of sky and desert, a place to write, to paint, to film his own projects, to breathe without the constant flash of cameras. On those sun-bleached acres he raised cattle, hosted friends, and experimented with small creative ventures. He filmed independent projects like Salt and Sea, and he captured endless hours of home footage, documenting both the grandeur of the land and the intimacy of family moments. Photographs lined the walls. Laughter echoed through certain rooms. To Val, this place wasn't just home. It was memory incarnate, a living archive of the life he was trying to hold together. But sanctuaries, no matter how vast, are not immune to the world's pressures. In the mid-2000s, financial realities came crashing down. Tax debts reported by the IRS in 2006 began to mount, pressing against him with the same relentlessness as the industry he'd sought to escape. The ranch, once his fortress, became both a blessing and a burden. By 2011, Val was forced to sell off more than 5,000 acres for nearly $18.5 million, shrinking his vast domain to just 160 acres. Each acre lost felt like more than land. It felt like selling fragments of his own history. He once confessed to a friend that letting go of that property was like selling pieces of his youth, the soil itself carrying the laughter of his children and the echo of moments with his father. The wound was not financial alone. It was deeply personal. Even attempts to turn the ranch into a source of income met resistance. Val opened part of it as a bed and breakfast, hoping to share its beauty with guests. But disputes with local residents over land use and traffic turned his refuge into a source of conflict. Instead of healing him, the sanctuary became yet another stage for battles, this time with neighbors rather than directors. The contrast was painful. The same land that had once cradled him with sunsets and star-filled skies now carried the scars of transactions and compromises. The wide-open silence that had promised solace became haunted by the voices of lawyers, real estate agents, and debt collectors. For a man who prized authenticity above all, watching his sacred ground reduced to numbers on a ledger was a devastating irony. Still, even in its diminished state, the ranch remained a fragment of his soul. On those remaining 160 acres, Val wandered under the amber light of desert evenings, sketchbook in hand, trying to capture in words and drawings what he could no longer preserve in acres. He filmed, he painted, he wrote, clinging to creation as a way to transform loss into something bearable. The ranch symbolized the paradox of his life. It was his sanctuary, yet it also became a reminder of fragility, financial fragility, emotional fragility, even spiritual fragility. The soil that had once grounded him now mirrored the erosion he felt inside. The boy who had once lost his brother and mother's warmth was now, decades later, losing pieces of land that had held his healing. Yet through it all, Val remained defiant. He mourned the acres gone, but he refused to let the last patch of desert vanish. He walked its trails as if to say, "This is still mine. This is still me." In the golden sunsets of New Mexico, he confronted one of life's cruel paradoxes. The very places we build for refuge can become reminders of sacrifice. The ranch had once promised healing, but it also etched into his story the truth that even sanctuaries can be lost. And while the land slipped through his hands, another storm was approaching, one not of property or reputation, but of the body itself. The very instrument that had carried his genius, his voice, was about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. By 2014, the body that had once carried Val Kilmer's relentless energy and commanding presence began to betray him. The diagnosis was brutal: throat cancer. For a man whose very essence was bound to his voice, the steel of Iceman, the fire of Jim Morrison, the haunted drawl of Doc Holliday. It was as if fate had chosen the cruelest possible target. His voice was not just an instrument. It was the lifeblood of his artistry, the bridge between his inner storms and the world that marveled at them. The treatments came quickly and without mercy. Surgeries cut deep into his throat, leaving scars outside and inside. 2 tracheotomies carved not just his airway but his confidence. A feeding tube protruded from his body, a daily reminder of mortality. Radiation and chemotherapy left him gaunt and frail, his once magnetic presence now marked by fragility. For a man who had built a career on embodying strength, charisma, and intensity, the mirror became a harsh adversary. But the cruelest blow was silence. The voice that once resonated with symphonic power was reduced to rasps and whispers. Simple conversations became impossible. He communicated with notebooks, scribbles, gestures. Fans who had adored his booming presence on screen could not have imagined the quiet exile he now lived. In the stillness of his home, he confessed in his journal, "I was once all thunder, all voice. Now paper must speak for me. For months, nights were the hardest." Alone in the dark, blinds half closed against city lights, he could hear his heartbeat louder than any applause. He would imagine the laughter of his children, the warmth of family dinners, the sound of scripts read aloud on set, echoes of a life that seemed impossibly far away. His faith, rooted in Christian Science, taught him to resist medical intervention. But his children, Mercedes and Jack, begged him to trust modern medicine. Torn between doctrine, pride, and love, he chose survival. It was not an easy surrender, but it was proof of his devotion to his family. Each painful swallow, each tentative attempt at speech became less about career and more about love, about staying alive for the people who refused to let him go. The world saw only glimpses of his battle. Occasionally he would appear at events. Thinner, quieter, his once confident frame diminished. Fans whispered. Tabloids speculated. But behind those appearances, Val was forging a new kind of artistry. If he could no longer speak, he would write. If he could no longer command the stage, he would film himself. He turned the lens inward, documenting his journey, capturing raw footage that would later become the heartbreaking, intimate documentary Val, 2021. In those recordings, the world saw a man stripped bare. No costumes, no scripts, just Val Kilmer facing mortality with vulnerability and courage. He could no longer roar like Iceman, but he could show the quiet resilience of a man unwilling to surrender the core of his spirit. Through journals, paintings, and footage, he redefined expression, proving that art can survive even when the body rebels. By 2017, when the public finally learned the full scope of his illness, Val did not seek pity. He sought connection. He wanted his story to be testimony, a reminder that brilliance, though scarred, endures. That creativity, even muted, persists. That the essence of Val Kilmer, the fire, the defiance, the devotion to truth, remained alive. His silence became its own form of eloquence. Where once his voice commanded stages and screens, now his presence itself spoke louder. Each appearance, each whisper, each written word reminded those who loved him that the human spirit can outlast even the harshest betrayals of flesh. For Val, the loss of his voice was not the end of his artistry. It was a transformation. He discovered that even when stripped of his greatest tool, he could still create, still inspire, still bear witness to the fragile persistence of life. And in that discovery, he taught his audience perhaps the most powerful lesson of all: that true brilliance is not measured by the sound of applause, but by the courage to endure when the applause has faded into silence. For more than 3 decades, audiences remembered him as Iceman, the rival, the equal, the cold steel at Tom Cruise's side in Top Gun. But by the time Top Gun, Maverick went into production, Val Kilmer's reality was far from that fighter pilot's sharp voice and unshakable gaze. Throat cancer had stolen the very sound that made him iconic. Speaking more than a few words was a struggle. Yet when the call came to reprise Iceman, it was not just an invitation to act again. It was a chance to reclaim a fragment of himself. The filmmakers, aware of his condition, built a scene around authenticity rather than spectacle. Through painstaking AI reconstruction of decades of recordings, they gave him back, for a brief moment, the voice that had been silenced. It was not entirely Val, not entirely technology, but something between, a ghost of sound, a bridge between past and present. On set, the atmosphere was electric with emotion. Tom Cruise, who had shared that first chapter of aviation legend with him back in 1986, insisted that Val be included. When the cameras rolled, it wasn't just Maverick looking into Iceman's eyes. It was Tom looking into Val's, seeing the years, the battles, the losses written across his friend's face. Director Joseph Kosinski later confessed it was the most emotional scene he had ever filmed. The dialogue was sparse, but it didn't need more. Every glance, every subtle movement of Val's hand on Tom's shoulder carried the weight of decades. It wasn't just a reunion of characters. It was a reunion of men who had walked different roads but were bound by history. The brief exchange became an elegy, a farewell, and a celebration all at once. Audiences worldwide felt it. In theaters, people wept not just for Iceman, but for Val Kilmer himself, for the man whose voice had been stolen, but whose presence still burned bright. The cameo became more than fan service. It was a reminder that some legends transcend the boundaries of time and illness. It was a living testament to survival. For Val, standing in front of the camera again was both triumphant and bittersweet. He remembered the first time he zipped into that flight suit, the rivalry that became friendship, the youthful laughter on set decades earlier. Now older, frailer but no less proud, he returned to say not goodbye, but I am still here. Even if only for a few moments the world could hear him again, see him again, not as a myth, but as a man who had endured. The scene in Top Gun. Maverick wasn't about action or spectacle. It was about connection, about two men, two characters, two histories intertwined. It left audiences breathless because it wasn't scripted drama. It was real. It was Val Kilmer, scarred but unbroken, offering one last performance not through volume or bravado but through the sheer weight of presence. In that moment, he gave back to the world what it had feared was gone forever. And perhaps he gave himself something too. The proof that even after silence, the human spirit can still find a way to speak. In his final years, Val Kilmer lived in a paradox of silence and creation. Though his voice had been stripped away, his spirit still sought expression. He divided his time between his shrunken ranch in New Mexico and occasional trips to Los Angeles for treatment. The ranch, once a vast expanse of 6,000 acres, was now reduced to 160, a fragment of its former glory. Yet in those desert sunsets, golden light spilling across the mesas, Val found a quieter kind of refuge. The world often imagined him as a man dying in loneliness, forgotten by the industry he had once lit ablaze. The truth was more nuanced. His children, Mercedes and Jack, stood faithfully by him, gathering like a circle of light in the shadow of illness. They were his anchors, the presence that kept him tethered to love even as his body weakened. They held his hand during treatments, listened patiently to his whispered words, and carried the burden of translating his silence for the world. Even as illness gnawed at him, Val refused to vanish into obscurity. Where his voice faltered, he painted. Where it failed, he wrote. Journals filled with reflections, regrets, and gratitude. Canvases bloomed with color, raw and imperfect, but undeniably alive. He revisited hundreds of hours of footage he had obsessively recorded throughout his life, entrusting it to his children as a final gift. That treasure trove of tapes became the foundation of the documentary Val, a portrait not of a superstar, but of a human being, scarred and unfiltered. Financial speculation swirled around him. Tabloids guessed his net worth, exaggerated debts, and questioned his stability. But in truth, the material wealth mattered little to him by then. The real fortune lay in memory. The laughter of his children, the scripts he had loved, the fragments of art he left behind. Land could be sold, contracts could dissolve, but the echoes of his presence, on film, on canvas, in words, were indelible. By his early 60s, the physical toll was undeniable. The tracheostomy left him voiceless. The feeding tubes and radiation thinned his frame until the mirror reflected not the fiery Iceman or the electric Morrison, but a frail man staring back at mortality. In his journal, he scrawled with trembling letters, "I was once all thunder, all voice. Now paper must speak for me." The ink smudged as though the page itself mourned. And still he rose each morning. He wrote. He painted. He watched old films, sometimes his own, sometimes others. He whispered to himself about the roles he didn't take, the stories left untold, the time he wished he had given more generously to his children. His regrets were many, but they did not drown him. Instead, they became part of his testimony, a reminder that even the brightest stars carry shadows. In the final months, when strength drained daily, Val still found ways to reach out. 5 weeks before his passing, he posted a wordless video on Instagram. In it, he lifted the Batman mask to his face, fragile, silent, yet defiant. The image spread across headlines, fans stunned by the unspoken farewell. He needed no words. The mask itself said everything. It was both goodbye and a reminder. I am still here, even in silence. On April 1st, 2025, at 65 years old, Val Kilmer took his last breath. The room was hushed, but not empty. His children were there, hands clasping his, pouring a lifetime of love into that final moment. There was no red carpet, no spotlight, no applause. Only the tender circle of family refusing to let him slip away unseen. He left not as a star, but as a father. An artist, a human being who had given everything to his craft and, in the end, gave his final gift in silence. The world mourned not just the loss of an actor, but of a man who had embodied gods, devils, and legends, yet remained achingly human. His passing tore open a silence in Hollywood itself, a reminder that behind every legend lies a fragile life. And perhaps his greatest performance was not on screen, but in those last quiet years, teaching us that dignity, creativity, and courage can survive even when voice and fame are gone. His story closes not with applause, but with echoes. Farewell, Iceman. Farewell, Jim Morrison. Farewell, Batman. Farewell, Val Kilmer, the man who turned pain into brilliance, silence into testimony, and left us with the reminder that sometimes the most powerful legacy is not the words spoken, but the questions left behind in the silence.